He could see that the break was incredibly clean, with only a slight indentation in the middle where it had snapped. Actually, closing the window is quite simple. Just tie a fishing line to a wooden rod placed under the window. The person outside closes the window slightly, pulls the fishing line, and the rod will automatically close the window. Pulling the line with a bit more force will break the rod in two. I see. Marcus Hahn nodded, pondering for a moment before speaking again. That being the case, my previous assumption was incorrect. I won't hide it from Lord Burns, I initially thought the thief might be someone close, as I'm the only one with a key. Now, the possibilities are much wider. Damien Burns remained silent. The talkative Lance Green wanted to speak up, but he had a persistent feeling that he would be punished if he did. Everyone remained silent, the atmosphere once again turning awkward. Marcus Hahn, despite her forthright nature, couldn't bear this repeated awkwardness. After sighing, she clasped her hands towards Damien Burns. I won't beat around the bush. I, Marcus Hahn, implore Lord Burns for assistance in finding this oxhorn mace. These losses may be insignificant to the Divine Weapon Manor, but they are a considerable blow to the Han Mei gang. At this moment, Lance Green finally understood why Damien Burns hadn't responded earlier. He was avoiding trouble. And yet, trouble had arrived anyway. Divine Weapon Manor has never conducted unfair business. Chief Marcus, what price will you pay for the Manor Lord to assist you? Damien Burns looked at Marcus Hahn. He didn't want to take on this trouble. This trip was for other matters, a leisurely journey, and he didn't want to waste his energy on something else. At this point, Marcus Hahn naturally hesitated. The Apricot Blossom Gang wasn't a wealthy sect. Now that even their most valuable horned ox scale had been stolen, what else could they possibly offer? Elliot Brooks turned to look at Damien Burns. Didn't the films say righteous sects help people out of the goodness of their hearts, expecting nothing in return? Why does Adam Gray want to take something from someone before helping? Could it be Adam Gray isn't actually a righteous cultivator? Doesn't need to be good, doesn't need to be a good person. If Lord Burns helps this time, half a month from now, our gang's horned ox scale, along with this coral-shaped ruby mountain, will certainly be delivered to Divine Weapon Manor. Marcus Hahn spoke, but her expression wasn't very good. These items were truly the Apricot Blossom Gang's most valuable possessions, but to Divine Weapon Manor, they were likely just a grain of sand in the desert. Damien Burns frowned, something flickering in his eyes. He had been avoiding trouble, yet he nodded. This manor's journey has other purposes. If time permits, I can help you investigate. Whether or not we find anything, I will give you an answer. How about that? Marcus Hahn was overjoyed and clasped her hands towards Damien Burns. Thank you, Lord Burns. Regardless of the outcome, the items I promised will be delivered to Divine Weapon Manor next month. Everyone lingered a bit longer at the Apricot Blossom Gang before returning to the inn. As soon as they arrived, Lance Green hurriedly voiced his doubts. Manor Lord, this Marcus Hahn is strange. Why would she be willing to pay such a high price to ask us to help her find that little bit of lost property? Not to mention the horned ox scale, just that coral-shaped ruby mountain alone was worth 100 horned ox scales. What was Marcus Hahn thinking? Damien Burns followed the waiter to the private room, 1. Elliot Brooks followed closely behind, while Lance Green and Evelyn Hall trailed a few steps behind, also entering the private room. 1. Private room, a type of elegant room where outsiders cannot see in. Damien Burns was ordering food. Hearing Lance Green's voice, he glanced at him with a faint smile, waved for the waiter to leave, and slowly poured tea for Elliot Brooks and himself, ignoring Lance. Lance Green shivered, as if doused with a bucket of cold water. Evelyn Hall also looked at Lance Green with disdain, but still shared her understanding. Chief Marcus said earlier that she suspected it was an inside job. If she wants our help, she surely knows who did it, but it's not easy for her to act herself, so she invited us to help. Is that so? Lance Green frowned after hearing this. He still felt something wasn't quite right. That's only one of the reasons. Damian Burns blew on the cup of tea he had just placed in front of Elliot Brooks and spoke. Marcus Hahn is likely the founder of the Apricot Blossom Gang, and her authority within the gang must be absolute. Dealing with a thief, however difficult, shouldn't require outside help. Elliot Brooks reached out and took the teacup, but didn't look at Damian Burns. His mood was sour, his crossbow trigger mechanism was gone, and he wondered if he truly had to find a replacement. Damian Burns slowly sipped his tea. The leaves weren't of the highest quality, yet in his hands, they tasted like the crisp air of a snowy mountain. So why? Lance Green inquired. Damian Burns shook his head again, his words diverging from his question. Lance Green, investigate this matter. I expect results within 3 days. Lance Green's face crumpled at the news. While the Crimson Hand Gang wasn't the largest, it was no small fry in Birchwood City. If they couldn't uncover anything, how could he? This wasn't even his usual line of work. Consider this punishment for your loose lips. If you fail, return to the estate and send Theodore here. You can manage the estate's affairs, big and small. Damian Burns delivered this decree slowly, pausing only when he saw Lance Green's already distressed expression worsen. Yes, master, Lance Green conceded, nodding despite his clear displeasure. Returning to the estate was the last thing he wanted. The rest of you, go and eat. You've been traveling, take this opportunity to rest properly. Damian Burns addressed Evelyn Hall, who nodded and pulled a reluctant Lance Green away. Lord Burns's table wasn't an easy place to sit. Proximity aside, one might lose their life to the toxins emanating from him. Damian Burns turned to Elliot Brooks, who was holding a teacup, a sullen expression on his face. Even without the ox-horn scale, there are other options. Don't be hasty. Elliot Brooks looked up at Damian Burns and carefully placed a small wooden box on the table. Opening it, he revealed a partially assembled crossbow. Removing the handle component from amongst the other parts, Elliot Brooks set it before Damian Burns, gesturing for him to examine it. Damian Burns picked it up. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Only after turning it over in his hands did he notice something unusual about the handle. Etched into the very end of the grip were the crudely carved words, Adam Gray. Adam Gray? What did it mean? Damian Burns looked at Elliot Brooks, his confusion evident. Elliot Brooks shook his head and pointed at him. Damian Burns frowned, then chuckled, reaching out to gently caress Elliot Brooks's face. My name is Damian Burns. Is this crossbow a gift for me? It dawned on Damian Burns that he hadn't told the boy his name. Others addressed him as master. As for the boy's name, he had chosen it himself. Elliot Brooks nodded. The other man's name didn't really matter to him. Why would you give this to me? Damian Burns asked. Because he was the first person to treat him with such kindness. Elliot Brooks looked at Damian Burns. Even his mother hadn't been this kind. Like with the tea earlier, this man had poured for him first, then himself, even taking the time to cool it. For Elliot Brooks, it wasn't about the order, but the fact that no one had ever shown him such meticulous care and attention. Since arriving in this world, this was the first person he had met, and this person had consistently been kind to him. He had to repay him. Seeing Elliot Brooks's silence, Damian Burns didn't press, instead asking a different question. You must have chosen the name Adam Gray for me, just as you chose Ash Waters for yourself. So, what is your real name? Elliot Brooks looked at Damian Burns, his lips moving soundlessly. Damian Burns's face hardened. He grabbed Elliot Brooks's shoulder and, in a swift movement, leaped away with him. Where Elliot Brooks had been sitting, a frost-covered throwing knife, wrapped in cloth, quivered. John Smith raised his hand and struck the already damaged tavern window across the street, creating a hole. The window of a room swung open, but no one was visible. John Smith pulled David Miller back to his original position and withdrew a throwing knife. Unfolding the cloth wrapped around it, he found no writing, only a piece of jewelry. The jewelry, crafted from silken threads and adorned with a single pearl, caused John Smith to frown. David Miller's eyes lit up at the sight of the silken thread, as if he had found a treasure, but then a flicker of disappointment crossed his face. There was only one. "Where is everyone?" John Smith called out abruptly, clearly not addressing the tavern staff. Several figures in black attire bearing the insignia of the Iron Mountain clan leaped through the window, one still chewing on a piece of bread. "Send word back and find out where the eldest daughter has gone," John Smith commanded, holding the cloth and jewelry, his brow still furrowed. "This subordinate knows," one of the guards stepped forward and replied. After the incident with the right protector, the young mistress left the clan. She didn't go to the madams either, saying she wanted to travel and clear her head. John Smith fingered the pearl on the forehead ornament, a hint of exasperation in his voice. "This young lady has quite the spirit." Emily Carter was the only daughter of George Harold, and John Smith was George Harold's sole disciple. Though not childhood sweethearts, they had always maintained a close bond. If not for John Smith's unique constitution, he might have even considered a romantic relationship with her. But Emily Carter was no ordinary woman. Fiercely independent and possessing a unique perspective, she had never shown romantic interest in John Smith, viewing him only as an older brother. She had even clashed with him due to her father's wishes. John Smith admired Emily Carter's character but didn't see their relationship evolving beyond a close sibling-like bond. Sighing again, John Smith instructed, "Investigate whether the young mistress is in Azure City. If you find her, tell her to come see me." "Yes, sir," the guards acknowledged, leaping back out the window. David Miller thought, why jump out the window? Is the door just for decoration? By this time, the waiter had brought the dishes John Smith had ordered. After the waiter left, John Smith gestured for David Miller to sit down. David Miller tugged on his sleeve, and John Smith turned to see his gaze fixated on the forehead ornament. "Want this?" John Smith raised his hand, holding the ornament in front of David Miller. David Miller reached out, but John Smith evaded him, pulling him down to the table and handing him chopsticks. You still haven't told me your name." "Name?" David Miller paused, reaching out to dip his finger in tea to write on the table, but John Smith caught his hand. "I want you to say it, not write it." Placing the forehead ornament on the table, John Smith held David Miller's hand, his gaze steady on the young man. David Miller seemed to instinctively frown. He didn't want to speak. To him, speaking was like eating a disliked dish, utterly unappealing. But the silk floss on the headband on the table truly captivated him, for just by looking, he sensed it was the perfect material for a crossbow string. Elliot Brooks's Adam's apple bobbed, his mouth still open. Elliot Brooks, the Elliot in patient, the Brooks in flowing brooks. Patient means that person, flowing brooks means flowing water, but I don't know what the two words mean together. Any expert who knows, please advise. Elliot Brooks's voice was very low and slightly hoarse. He had stopped talking when he was young, so even though he had passed puberty, his voice still had a youthful, even childlike quality. Damian Burns didn't know why, but hearing it made his heart ache, a slightly itchy feeling. "Elliot Brooks," he repeated, drawing out the last syllable and pushing the headband towards Elliot Brooks. Elliot Brooks quickly put the headband away, seemingly terrified that Damian Burns would change his mind. The food on the table was plentiful, a plate of beef with bean sauce, a plate of stir-fried vegetables, a plate of sliced duck, and a small pot of beef bone soup. 3 dishes and a soup, all very fragrant. Damian Burns reached out with his chopsticks, picked up some beef with bean sauce, and placed it in Elliot Brooks's bowl, saying, "From now on, Ash Waters, speak more. Your voice is pleasant, it's a shame not to use it." Elliot Brooks also picked up his chopsticks, put the beef in his mouth, and disagreed with Damian Burns in his heart. He still felt that if he could avoid speaking, he should. After all, if he didn't speak, no one would know what had really happened. Because of the horned ox scale and the search for Diana Cloud, everyone's departure was delayed. Although the matter of the horned ox scale was left to Lance Green, Evelyn Hall still accompanied him to Hanmei Province again. Woman to woman, there were some ways of communication that men didn't know. Elliot Brooks huddled in his room, assembling small crossbows. The silk floss from Damian Burns's headband wasn't very long, but Elliot Brooks seemed very pleased. As for Damian Burns, the leader of the group, he was now the most idle. Diana Cloud was a skilled martial artist, so he wasn't worried about her safety. As for the horned ox scale matter, although he had agreed to help, he wasn't truly patient. He disliked complications and, having delegated it to Lance Green, he wanted nothing more to do with it. The shopkeeper's generous gesture was truly satisfying. Idle people with nothing to do often seek something to occupy themselves. For example, Damian Burns spent the entire day in Elliot Brooks's room, watching him assemble crossbows. Even though Elliot Brooks was always quiet, being watched like that made him uncomfortable. If he hadn't disliked speaking, he would have scolded Damian Burns long ago. He added the string to the finished crossbow and placed it on the table before Damian Burns. The handle still bore the inscription Adam Gray, unchanged. Damian Burns picked up the crossbow and examined it carefully. The wooden frame was polished smooth, coated with oil, making it comfortable to hold, neither rough nor slippery. Elliot Brooks moved to Damian Burns's side, reached out, and cocked the crossbow for him. An arrow from the quiver slotted into the groove, resting against the string. Elliot Brooks aimed at the rafter, then squeezed the trigger. The arrow shot out with a sharp whoosh, a thwack echoing as half the shaft embedded itself in the wood. Damian Burns observed the arrow lodged deep within the rafter, silent. He recognized it as an ordinary arrow, the kind sold cheaply on the streets, 2 cartloads for a couple of silver pieces. The shaft itself was whittled by Elliot Brooks from leftover crossbow scraps. Yet, this simple arrow, easily broken into pieces, was embedded so deeply. The power of the crossbow was undeniable. Such a formidable weapon. Damian Burns lowered his gaze to the crossbow in his hand. The hand gripping his own wasn't large, and it hadn't yet let go, the same hand that had crafted this device. Truly dangerous hands. No, perhaps it was the owner of these hands who was dangerous, conceiving such a perilous creation. Damian Burns looked up to meet Elliot Brooks' wide, expectant eyes, blinking as if awaiting praise. A numbness spread through Damian Burns as he tightened his grip on the crossbow's stock. Someone like this, despite devising such a dangerous weapon, couldn't be perceived as threatening. He was clearly just a naive, innocent youth. Ash, you're incredibly skilled to have crafted such a powerful weapon. Damian Burns placed the crossbow on the table and patted Elliot Brooks' hand. As expected, Elliot Brooks' eyes lit up at the compliment, sparkling as he gazed at Damian Burns. Damian Burns. The urge to reach out and touch his face was strong. However, Damian Burns' thought was interrupted by a knock at the door. Master Burns, Howard Leader has arrived and is currently dining downstairs. The guard outside announced. Howard Harrison. Damian Burns frowned, glancing at Elliot Brooks before a smile touched his lips. The young man hadn't yet asked for his painted fan. He wondered if Elliot still remembered. Now, Howard Harrison had personally delivered it. Tell him to rest after his meal. It's late. Have him come see me tomorrow. Early the next morning, Howard Harrison knocked on Damian Burns' door, but he wasn't there. Master Leader, please stop knocking. Master Burns is with young Master Ash. A divine weapon manor guard appeared, addressing Howard Harrison. Young Master Ash. Howard Harrison was puzzled. He had been confined to the manor's forge, unaware of even the Right Protector's betrayal, let alone Elliot Brooks' existence. Young Master Ash is a friend of Master Burns. He stayed at the villa a few days ago, but you were in the forge then, Master Leader. Howard Harrison was somewhat convinced by the guard's explanation. After all, there was much he didn't know. As the Heavenly Works Hall leader, he managed the most crucial part of Divine Weapon Manor. Divine Weapon Manor's reputation for swordsmithing was unparalleled. Even the military used a significant portion of their weaponry, a testament to their craftsmanship. As the Heavenly Works Hall leader, Howard Harrison's forging skills were exceptional. Aside from Damian Burns and Diana Cloud, he was arguably the manor's top smith, even receiving personal instruction from Lewis Harold, though not formally his apprentice. In the martial world, some would pay handsomely for a weapon of his making, while others would resell it for an exorbitant price. His creations were highly sought after. Elliot Brooks's room wasn't far from Damian Burns's, situated between Lance Green's and Evelyn Hall's rooms, effectively guarding him. However, due to Lance Green and Evelyn Hall being occupied for the past 2 days, Howard Harrison hadn't seen either of them since arriving last night. Upon reaching Elliot Brooks's room, Howard Harrison found the door ajar and could see inside. They were having breakfast, 2 steamer baskets of buns, 2 vegetable dishes, and porridge were on the table. A young man sat beside Damian Burns, quietly eating, occasionally receiving vegetables and conveniently placed buns from Damian. The young man wore a light blue robe. His hair was shorter than Damian Burns's, but his perpetually lowered head obscured his face. So close. Howard Harrison's lips twitched in alarm, eyes widening. Damian was using his own chopsticks to serve the young man. Wouldn't he be poisoned? He won't be. The young master and the Lord are always this close. He's not afraid of being poisoned. A nearby guard, seemingly sensing Howard Harrison's fear, offered an explanation. They're always this close. If poison were a concern, it would have happened already. Perhaps their presence at the door was disruptive. After 2 buns and a bowl of porridge, Elliot Brooks slowly set down his chopsticks and looked towards the entrance. Of all the skilled smiths at Divine Weapon Manor, Howard Harrison most resembled a sledgehammer-wielding blacksmith by the forge. Considerably taller than the 6 feet 3 inches Damian Burns, his appearance was unremarkable, even plain. Despite his black robe, his powerful muscles were evident. Standing at the doorway, he resembled a mountain blocking the entrance, partially obscuring even the guard. From now on, I'll call him Harrison, 2 meters, Elliot Brooks put down his chopsticks, Damian Burns, having already finished, did the same. Come in, have a seat, Damian Burns gestured to a slightly distant spot. Yes, Lord. After sitting, Howard Harrison retrieved a long, black box from his chest and placed it on the table. These are the fan ribs you requested, Lord. Fan ribs? Seeing the long box, Elliot Brooks clapped his hands. He'd been trying to remember what he'd forgotten. Elliot Brooks glared at Damian Burns. They had agreed to deliver them before leaving, yet it had taken this long. Ignoring the fiery glare, Damian Burns reached for the box and opened it. Inside, 16 small and 2 large fan ribs were neatly stacked. Except for the 2 larger ones, each was exquisitely crafted, uniform in thickness and hollow. Placing the ribs before Elliot Brooks, seemingly as appeasement, Damian Burns turned to Howard Harrison. Why did you come yourself? Weren't you content to remain in the forge until death? Damian Burns asked with a smirk. Howard Harrison immediately adopted a mournful expression. I don't know what Lady Eleanor did, but she ran off. Madam Burns couldn't find her, left Protector Miles is busy, and she doesn't dare approach the sanctuary. So, she's been wailing outside the forge. If the Lord hadn't forbidden her entry, she'd have demolished it by now. I had to escape. Upon hearing this, Damian Burns frowned immediately. That previous incident didn't stop her. This Grand Madam was a woman Lewis Harold knew before he established the Divine Weapon Manor. Back then, Lewis Harold was already a renowned martial arts hero, but he had no intention of marrying and didn't value the Grand Madame's arrogant and stubborn personality. Unexpectedly, this arrogant and stubborn Grand Madame was also cunning. She schemed to get Lewis Harold into her chambers, drugged him with an aphrodisiac, and the next morning, sent people to invite numerous martial arts sects to witness the aftermath of their drunken indiscretion. Lewis Harold, being a responsible man, coupled with the pressure from the various sects and the Grand Madame, had no choice but to marry her. After many years of marriage, Lewis Harold often wandered outside and rarely returned home. After various trials and tribulations, he finally established Divine Weapon Manor. As for the Grand Madame, she didn't have a daughter, Diana Cloud, until she was 30. Later, Lewis Harold, perhaps having a change of heart, handed over the position of Manor Lord to Damien Burns and gave the Grand Madame a letter of retirement, stating that she could leave if she wished, or stay and be provided for by the Divine Weapon Manor. After Damien Burns took over as Manor Lord, the Grand Madame caused a commotion. Although Damien Burns didn't seem like a ruthless person, he showed no mercy to his adoptive mother, confining her for over 6 months until she quieted down. During the incident of the Right Protector's betrayal, this Grand Madame, for reasons unknown, married her own daughter to Thomas Fletcher. No wonder Diana Cloud ran away. The Grand Madame resorted to her old tricks, drugging Diana Cloud, causing her to remain unconscious for over half a month except for when eating and drinking. On her wedding day, she was even given a drug to suppress her inner energy. Diana Cloud, likely completely disheartened by her mother, ran away. Now, the Grand Madame has the audacity to make a fuss about searching for her daughter. Perhaps the Grand Madame genuinely misses her daughter. As soon as Howard Harrison spoke these words, he didn't believe them himself, especially given the recent events. Damien Burns rubbed his forehead, harboring no fondness for the Grand Madame. Damien Burns had disliked the Grand Madame since he was a child. When they first met, Damien Burns was just a young boy. Although dressed neatly, he couldn't hide his delicate features. At the time, the Grand Madame mistook him for a girl and took a liking to him. However, upon their first contact, she was poisoned and bedridden for half a month. This incident led to her intense dislike for Damien Burns, which later morphed into resentment when he assumed the position of Manor Lord, a position she believed belonged to Diana Cloud. She disliked Damien Burns, and he, in turn, held no particular animosity towards her. However, he hadn't anticipated that the Grand Madame would hold a grudge against him for the poisoning incident. She plotted against him when he was still a child, locking him in the dungeon behind the mountain, where he nearly starved to death. "Forget it, I'll deal with it when I return to the manor." As they continued their conversation, Elliot Brooks pushed aside the food on the table and arranged the folding fan ribs from the box onto the table, seemingly fascinated by them. He held a large fan rib, toying with it in his hand, squinting at the space between the ribs, contemplating his next move. First, he needed to create a small mechanism that could launch hidden weapons. He also needed to make the needles for the hidden weapons, ensuring they were long and thin. Finally, he needed to address the fan's surface. A fan was the simplest of these items. Elliot Brooks turned, glancing at the purple robe Damien Burns wore. "Adam Gray's attire is quite suitable," he mused. Without further thought, Elliot Brooks retrieved a small pair of nail scissors from the guest room's vanity, returned to the table, grabbed Damien Burns's sleeve, and snipped. However, the scissors were clearly dull and the screw loose. The blades left no mark on Damien Burns's robe. Frustrated, Elliot Brooks looked up, scissors in hand, to find both Damien Burns and Howard Harrison staring at him. Howard Harrison's expression was one of utter bewilderment. Clack. Elliot Brooks placed the scissors on the table, his gaze shifting between Howard Harrison and Damien Burns. Had he done something wrong? Why were they looking at him like that? Damien Burns examined his pristine sleeve, now marked by a small tug, then glanced at the scissors and fan ribs on the table. His furrowed brow, creased from the earlier mention of his wife, suddenly smoothed. This person, he thought, always has a way of making one laugh and cry at the same time. Aloud, he said, "Ash Waters, if you want a fan, I'll have someone find one for you. While my robes are somewhat valuable, they're not suitable material for your fan project." Elliot Brooks blinked. Was Damian Burns going back on his word again, promising something only to deliver it much later? "Don't worry," Damian Burns continued, "this time, it's readily available." Damian Burns pulled Elliot Brooks down to sit, then turned to look at the dumbfounded Howard Harrison. "Since you don't want to stay at the mountain villa, then come with me. This trip happens to involve forging, so it's more convenient for you to tag along." "Yes, Master Burns," Howard Harrison replied, rising and clasping his hands. Howard Harrison stood up and bowed respectfully. Lance Green and Evelyn Hall emerged from Hanmei Estate. It was now midday, the sun was bright, and the streets relatively empty. Their 2-day investigation hadn't been entirely fruitless. In Hanmei Estate, they discovered a man named Henry Sun, highly valued by Marcus Han. He was in charge of security, and it seemed all the men in the estate were under his command. The night the ox horn scale was stolen, Henry's son was not at the estate, but rather spending the night at a brothel. Lance Green's inquiries at the brothel confirmed Henry's son's alibi, but strangely, the woman who had served him that night had disappeared. A brothel visit, a missing woman, and a stolen ox horn scale, individually, these events were unremarkable, but together, they raised suspicions. Henry's son had initially followed Marcus Han, contributing significantly to the establishment of Hanmei Estate. However, over time, although he continued to work for the estate, his personality had changed considerably. According to Marcus Han, Henry's son had once been quite tactful. While not exactly gentle and courteous, he had been agreeable. Now, he had become arrogant and overbearing, even openly defying Marcus Han's orders. Although Marcus Han considered him a brother, he increasingly felt that Henry's son was aiming to usurp control of the estate and strip him of his authority. "This is such a hassle. Why did Master Burns dump this on me? I'm completely out of my depth." Lance Green complained, his face a mask of misery. "Serves you right for not being able to keep your mouth shut," Evelyn Hall retorted, rolling her eyes. Despite her words, she continued to assist him. She wasn't complaining about the workload, so why was he, the instigator, whining? "Serves you right," Evelyn Hall said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "If you hadn't opened your big mouth, we wouldn't be in this mess." Despite her words, she continued to help. She hadn't complained of being tired, so what right did he have? Lance Green, speechless, silently resolved to be less talkative in the future. Evelyn Hall was about to say something more when her eyes suddenly stopped, then she quickly pulled a disgruntled Lance Green forward. "Hey! What are you doing? Pulling so hard. Can't you be gentler? Act like a lady." Lance Green, caught off guard, stumbled a couple of steps before following her. "Shut up." Evelyn Hall's almond-shaped eyes widened. This Lance Green, even if his martial arts weren't the best, he was still a hall leader. Why was he so talkative? Evelyn Hall pulled Lance Green along, sticking to secluded areas. They wandered around for a good half hour before finally stopping in a deserted alleyway. Evelyn Hall whipped out her soft whip, cracking it in the air. It made a sharp sound. "Expressionless," she said, "been following us for this long, aren't you coming out?" Lance Green finally understood why Evelyn Hall had been dragging him around. His face flushed, not from embarrassment, but anger. She hadn't told him why they were taking this roundabout route. Infuriating. His martial arts were the weakest of the 4 halls, but surely he wasn't a liability. She didn't even tell him he was being followed. How inconsiderate. Evelyn Hall retracted her whip. 2 masked figures finally emerged, dressed in commoners' clothes, but wearing grotesque masks. Seeing the masks, both Evelyn Hall and Lance Green's expressions changed. They exchanged a look, each recognizing the gravity in the other's eyes. The Wandering Cloud Villa was similar to the Divine Weapon Manor. For the right price, you could get what you desired. The Divine Weapon Manor offered divine weapons, while the Wandering Cloud Villa offered lives. They traded lives for wealth. Wandering Cloud Villa. Evelyn Hall took a step forward, tightening her grip on her soft whip. Her whole body tensed, ready to pounce on the masked figures at any moment. Behind her, Lance Green also drew his weapon, a short, gleaming sword. Everyone knew that when the Wandering Cloud Villa's people wore masks, it meant their target had been chosen. Either kill the assassins, or wait for death. Please don't misunderstand. We're not here for an assignment. One of the masked figures clasped their hands, their voice remarkably gentle. Hearing this, Evelyn Hall didn't lower her weapon. She asked warily, "What do you want?" The other masked figure stepped forward slightly and produced a letter from their chest. "Someone paid us to deliver this letter to Lord Burns." Damian Burns' presence in Azure Cloud City wasn't a secret. Anyone with a bit of influence could find out, though no one knew where he was staying. In recent days, due to Elliot Brooks, Damian Burns had only left once to visit the Crimson Plum gang and hadn't left the inn since. The Divine Weapon Manor security was tight, no one knew which inn he was at. They had to try other means. These two hall leaders of the Divine Weapon Manor were certainly with Damian Burns. Following them would inevitably lead to him. They hadn't expected to be discovered. The Wandering Cloud Villa had its own unique concealment methods, unknown to outsiders, but everyone knew how effective they were. Once hidden, unless one was a truly formidable expert, they wouldn't be detected. Yet, this time, they had been. Evelyn Hall didn't immediately accept the letter, but remarked sarcastically, "Since when has Blackwood Manor taken on such trivial tasks? This is a rare occurrence." The two masked figures remained motionless, still holding the letter forward. "Please, deliver this letter to Lord Burns. If you're not at ease, we can accompany you." Evelyn Hall turned to look at Lance Green. Lance Green nodded to her. Unsure of the letter's contents, and to avoid unnecessary complications, having the two accompany them seemed prudent. Evelyn Hall tucked her soft whip into her belt, brushed off her sleeves, and said, "Then follow me." Evelyn Hall led the way, the two masked figures followed her, and Lance Green brought up the rear, acting as a precaution. At the inn, Damian Burns was observing Elliot Brooks. On the table sat a bamboo tube containing more than a dozen silver needles, thin as ox hair but quite long, filled with water. Elliot Brooks was currently holding Damian Burns's finger. Elliot Brooks held a silver needle in one hand and Damian Burns's finger in the other. The needle was poised at Damian Burns's fingertip, but wouldn't pierce the skin. He looked up at Damian Burns. "It's all right, Ash. Just go ahead and prick it." Damian Burns smiled at the young man. He hadn't expected such audacity, the boy actually wanted to use his blood to create a hidden weapon. It was a truly devious idea. In truth, the idea had come to Elliot Brooks suddenly. He vividly remembered the fate of those who came into contact with Damian Burns's blood, hence his desire to soak the silver needles in it. Needles thus steeped would become poisonous, their efficacy significantly enhanced. The needle tip pressed against Damian Burns's fingertip, but wouldn't penetrate further. Elliot Brooks looked at the long, slender finger, calloused at the joints. It felt comfortable to the touch. At that moment, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway, and the door burst open. Lance Green blurted out, "Master." This startled Elliot Brooks, causing his hand to tremble. The needle, which he'd hesitated to insert, suddenly plunged deep into Damian Burns's finger. Damian Burns frowned at Lance Green's abrupt entrance, paying no attention to his finger. Though the saying went, 10 fingers connected to the heart, he seemed unfazed. Lance Green took in the scene, then glanced at the silver needle in Damian Burns's finger. His expression stiffened, and he instinctively took a step back. "Blackwood Manor has sent someone. They say they have a letter for you, Master." Tell them to wait for me in my room. Damian Burns's expression remained unchanged as he addressed Lance Green. And when we return to the manor, your monthly allowance is halved for 6 months. Lance Green retreated with a pained expression. Damian Burns turned his attention to the now blackened needle in his finger. Elliot Brooks had already withdrawn it, looking at him anxiously. Damian Burns pulled the needle from his finger. Fresh blood welled from the puncture. He squeezed his finger, letting several drops fall into the bamboo tube. The blood dissolved in the water. The water gradually turned a pale red, the silver needles within simultaneously blackening. After dropping the needle in his hand into the tube, Damian Burns sealed it himself. Then he looked at Elliot Brooks, completely unconcerned with his still bleeding finger. Elliot Brooks's face flushed. The sight of Damian Burns's blood had dispelled his anxiety. He stared intently at Damian Burns's bleeding finger. Gulp, gulp, gulp. Elliot Brooks's stomach growled. There was only a small amount of blood, barely a scent, yet it intensified Damian Burns's own unique aroma, triggering Elliot Brooks's sudden hunger. He stared blankly at the finger, his gaze vacant. Hungry? Damian Burns wiggled his finger. Elliot Brooks's eyes followed the movement. Recalling the last time the young man had sucked blood from his finger, Damian Burns, as if compelled, extended his hand towards Elliot Brooks's lips. As expected, Elliot Brooks opened his mouth, taking Damian Burns's finger and licking the blood clean with his tongue. He then grasped Damian Burns's hand with both of his own, sucking intently. The soft touch against his finger, the tingling sensation from the puncture wound, the feeling of blood flowing out, Damian Burns stared, somewhat dazed, at the person so close to him. Damian? Evelyn Hall appeared at the door, speechless with astonishment at the scene before her. Evelyn Hall was truly stunned into silence. It wasn't the fact that the young master was drinking Damian Burns's blood that shocked her. She had no idea what they had been doing before she arrived. It was the intimacy of their posture that left her dumbfounded. 2 men being intimate wasn't unusual in itself, but one of them was Damian Burns. She had never seen him show such care for anyone. Despite his toxicity, he was still human. Surely, he wasn't immune to attraction. Everyone experiences the novelty of love, but Damian Burns was like an unfeeling statue. Many had tried, hoping for a platonic connection with him, but all had failed and given up. She had questioned why the clueless young master had been brought along on what was supposed to be a serious business trip to the Crimson Willow Society. She'd assumed it was for the Oxhorn scale, but now the reason was clear. So, the master had these preferences. Well, the young man was undeniably beautiful, with those large, childlike eyes that held an air of innocence. And most importantly, he could handle any level of intimacy with the master. Perhaps sensing Evelyn Hall's intense gaze, Elliot Brooks, without turning his head, released Damian Burns's finger. Noticing some residual blood, he extended his tongue to lick it clean. Damian Burns rubbed his saliva-coated finger, casting a disapproving look at Evelyn Hall in the doorway before turning back to Elliot Brooks. Elliot Brooks was clearly in a state of altered consciousness. Though still seated, his eyes were vacant. He often appeared somewhat dazed, but this was different, like a wooden figure. This had happened several times now. Why? A flicker of doubt crossed Damian Burns's mind. He waved a hand in front of Elliot Brooks's face, but there was no reaction. It seemed that even releasing his finger earlier was simply due to the lack of further blood. Ash, I'm going out. If you get hungry, Evelyn is outside. Just call for her. Lifting Elliot Brooks and placing him on the bed, Damian Burns bent down, observing the vacant expression on his face, unsure if his words had even registered. Damian Burns left the room, closing the door behind him. Turning to face Evelyn Hall, he saw her bright-eyed and clearly intrigued by what she had witnessed. Stay here and watch. If Ash wakes up, call me. Yes, master. Evelyn said, He's not master. He's with the young master. What? Damien looked at her. No, it's nothing. People from Whispering Pines are in the guest room. Evelyn shook her head, gesturing towards Damien's room. Damien nodded, rubbed the prick on his finger that had stopped bleeding, and turned towards his room. Two masked figures stood in the guest room, waiting for Damien. After he sat down, a guard poured him some tea. Why are the Whispering Pines people looking for me? Damien lowered his eyes, lifted the teacup, skimmed the foam with the lid, and took a slow sip. Someone paid us to deliver this letter to Lord Burns. The two masked figures took out a letter and respectfully placed it on the table. While they might remain unfazed before Lance and Evelyn, they dared not show any disrespect in front of Damien. Damien, however, was unafraid. He reached for the letter, opened it, and shook its contents onto the table. A piece of paper and a thin piece of metal fell out. Damien picked up the metal piece. It felt icy cold to the touch. Pressing on it, he could sense its solidity. Unfolding the letter, Damien scanned it twice, a hint of mockery flashing in his eyes. He looked up at the two masked figures. You've delivered the letter. You can leave now. The two masked figures exchanged glances. One of them clasped their hands towards Damien. Besides delivering the letter, our master has a message for Lord Burns. The other masked figure stepped forward. Our master says the medicine has been found. We await the grim Damien on June 5th. Before the masked figure finished speaking, Damien's eyes sharpened. Still seated, he flicked his wrist. A silver light accompanied by a gust of venomous wind struck the speaker's chest. The masked figure, struck in the chest, didn't stumble back but collapsed where they stood, a silver needle, the length of a finger, embedded in their chest. The other masked figure didn't react in time. By the time they reached out, their companion was already dead. Damien, with a look of disgust, brushed off his sleeve and stood, slowly approaching the remaining masked figure. Go back and tell your master, if she doesn't repent after June 5th, then she can expect Whispering Pines to change its name. I will relay Lord Burns' words. I'll take my leave. A barely perceptible tremor in their voice, the masked figure scooped up their companion's body and fled. Once the footsteps faded, Damien slowly returned to the table, picked up the metal piece, and looked again at the contents of the letter. _____ what you need, we also have. Await good news from the grim Damien. Cowards. Tossing the metal piece onto the table, Damien turned to go to Elliot's room. Master. A guard called from outside the door. What is it? Damien looked over to see Diana, dressed in white, slowly ascending the stairs. Upon seeing him, she quickened her pace. Brother. Lydia Green approached, bowing to Arthur Bell, each movement elegant. I didn't expect brother to be in Beechwood City as well. I thought I was the only one who didn't want to stay cooped up in the mountains. Arthur Bell looked at her, turned, and walked back into the room, casually asking, I remember you had a silk ice forehead ornament. Didn't you like it very much? Why aren't you wearing it? Lydia Green touched her forehead and followed Arthur Bell into the room. It went missing a few days ago. It's just an ornament anyway, so I didn't pay much attention to it. Lydia Green sat down, poured herself some tea, and asked suspiciously, why did brother suddenly remember to ask about this? Arthur Bell didn't answer her question, but took a pearl from his sleeve and placed it on the table. Wasn't it the one from Amelia White's ornament? Huh. Lydia Green saw the pearl and became even more suspicious. How did this end up with brother? Did I drop it at the estate and not bring it with me? Arthur Bell just shook his head. Although his whereabouts weren't a secret, Beechwood City wasn't too big or too small. Finding him still took some effort. Even the people from the Rivermist estate had to go through Eleanor Hall and Liam Green to find him. The person who delivered this ornament could find him on the second day, indicating a deep familiarity with his movements. Moreover, Lydia Green losing her ornament seemed like a small matter, but to stealthily take something from Lydia Green's side without being noticed wasn't an easy task. It seemed the estate wasn't entirely clean. Lydia Green, seeing Arthur Bell's silence, and recalling their previous conversation, immediately sensed the crux of the matter. She couldn't help but furrow her elegant brows and fell silent. But just as they quieted down, Eleanor Hall's side became restless. As Arthur Bell and Lydia Green sat in silence, they heard a scream from outside, coming from the direction of Ethan Brooks's room. Arthur Bell's eyes sharpened. By the time Lydia Green looked over, he had already left the room, so she had to follow. Arthur Bell's arrival didn't completely alleviate Eleanor Hall's panic. She stared wide-eyed at Ethan Brooks's room, a soft whip in her hand, but she didn't dare to approach. The screams continued. Arthur Bell and Lydia Green looked into the room. Broken dishes and bowls were scattered on the floor, along with spilled wine and porridge. A waiter was pinned down, screaming continuously. The clothes on his shoulder were torn, a chunk of flesh missing. Ethan Brooks was on top of the waiter, gnawing on a piece of flesh, his eyes vacant, seemingly devoid of any sense. Sebastian Waters. Arthur Bell called softly, taking 2 steps forward and grabbing Ethan Brooks's arm, pulling him up. Only then was Eleanor Hall roused by Arthur Bell's call. Seeing Ethan Brooks's blood-covered mouth, she was speechless. The waiter seized the opportunity, scrambling up and running away, yelling, "Murder! Murder!" Arthur Bell firmly held Ethan Brooks's waist from behind. Seeing the waiter fleeing and screaming, he gave a meaningful look to the just-recovered Eleanor Hall. Understanding, she immediately used her lightness skill to pursue him. Held by Arthur Bell, Ethan Brooks didn't stop his movements. Seeing his prey escape, he kicked wildly, trying to give chase, his hands reaching out as if trying to catch the waiter. Ash Waters. At this moment, Elliot Brooks's strength was truly overwhelming, and coupled with Damian Burns's unwillingness to hurt him, he could only tightly embrace Elliot Brooks. Seeing Elliot Brooks struggling so fiercely, his whole body lunged forward, so Damian reached out, intending to restrain him by the neck. Who knew, this restraining action only made Elliot Brooks struggle more violently. He began to speak, his originally hoarse voice now a strained yell, like the screech of metal. "So hungry. Elu is so hungry. Don't eat me, don't eat me. Elu is really hungry, Elu doesn't want to eat meat. Meat is so difficult to eat. So hungry." Hearing Elliot Brooks say this, Damian Burns's expression momentarily froze, and immediately after, he tightened his hold on Elliot Brooks, preventing him from struggling. Diana Cloud, standing outside the door, heard Elliot Brooks's words and her expression also changed. Recalling Elliot Brooks's previous actions, it wasn't difficult to guess what the meat he spoke of actually was. Ash Waters. "If it's not tasty, we won't eat it anymore, it's okay, we won't eat." Damian Burns tried to whisper in Elliot Brooks's ear, but he himself didn't realize the pity that laced his voice. Damian Burns's voice seemed to have an effect, as Elliot Brooks's struggles lessened somewhat, though he still muttered to himself. "But Elu is so hungry, Elu is so hungry." Damian Burns turned Elliot Brooks around and held him close, gently patting his back, trying to comfort him in the gentlest tone possible. "Good Ash Waters, we'll go eat right now." At this point, Elliot Brooks could no longer distinguish who was in front of him. The taste of blood filled his mouth, causing every cell in his body to tremble with hunger. Swallowing a piece of raw flesh hadn't brought him satisfaction, but instead, made him even hungrier. Damian Burns pressed Elliot's head against his chest, but this only filled Elliot Brooks's sense of smell with the toxins on Damian's body, and his taste buds recalled the delicious flavor of Damian Burns's blood. "Ah!" Damian Burns frowned, tilting his head to look at Elliot Brooks biting into his shoulder. Blood soaked his clothes, and if the fabric weren't stronger than usual, the result would likely be the same as the waiter's. Elliot Brooks held Damian Burns tightly, seemingly greedily sucking to satisfy himself with the blood. In the fabric. Senior brother. Diana Cloud, who had been frowning and watching, couldn't restrain herself any longer when she saw Damian Burns injured. With lightning speed, she struck the back of Elliot Brooks's neck. Damian Burns shifted his feet slightly, but didn't move Elliot Brooks out of the way. Diana Cloud's blow instantly knocked Elliot Brooks unconscious. His body went limp and fell into Damian Burns's arms, his mouth releasing Damian's shoulder, his lips covered in blood. After knocking Elliot Brooks unconscious, Diana Cloud stepped back to avoid Damian Burns's blood. Damian Burns bent down, carefully lifted Elliot Brooks, and placed him on the bed. Only then did he reach up to cover his shoulder. Although his clothes weren't torn, a chunk of flesh had been bitten out of his shoulder by Elliot Brooks, and the extent of the injury was unknown. Someone. Damian Burns called out, and Lance Green entered. He seemed somewhat sluggish, apparently quite shaken by Elliot Brooks's state. After returning with the masked figure, he had been preparing to eat dinner, but was unexpectedly startled by Elliot Brooks's cries and the previous situation. Go fetch a physician and bring me the antidote you carry. Damian Stone's face was grim, unsure if he was angry at Elliot Baker. Yes. Lance Fields, no longer able to maintain his usual jovial demeanor, grabbed a small bag, pulled out 2 vials and a paper packet, placed them on the table, and hurried off to fetch a physician. Damian Stone wiped the blood from Elliot Baker's face, then slowly walked to the table. Unconcerned by Diana Cloud's presence, he unbuttoned his shirt, opened the 2 small vials, and sprinkled the contents directly onto his bitten shoulder. The reddish-black powder landed on the wound, causing Damian Stone to wince slightly. The wound wasn't deep or large, but the force of the bite had nearly torn away a chunk of flesh. After applying the medicine, Damian Stone casually bandaged the wound with a strip of cloth. He returned to the bedside, gazing at the unconscious Elliot Baker. Brother, what kind of person is he, really? Diana Cloud stepped forward, filled with worry and curiosity about Elliot Baker. She had encountered the young man once before on a mountain path. While surprised by his proximity to Damian Stone, she hadn't formed a strong impression. Now, witnessing Elliot Baker's frenzied state, she couldn't help but feel intrigued. I don't know. Damian Stone shook his head. You don't know? Diana Cloud echoed. Of course, he didn't know. Damian Stone looked at the unconscious Elliot Baker. The young man's face now appeared innocent, harmless. If it weren't for the pain in his shoulder, if it weren't for the blood on Elliot Baker's shirt, it would be impossible to imagine his earlier frenzy. After Walter White's suspicions about Elliot Baker, he had discreetly allowed him to investigate, but the results were inconclusive. The first place the young man had appeared was at the base of the cliff. Before that, there was no trace of him. If it weren't for a powerful background that even the Stone Mountain sect couldn't touch, what could explain his lack of history? But could anyone truly be more powerful than the Stone Mountain sect? Moreover, Damian Stone couldn't claim to know Elliot Baker. He was usually quiet, even docile. Why this sudden, violent outburst? What was the reason? Damian Stone couldn't figure it out. Silence settled over the room. Evelyn Hall and Howard Harris entered. Evelyn Hall looked at the quiet young man on the bed and shook her head. Sect leader, the servants have taken care of everything. Damian Stone nodded, paused, then asked, what happened? Why did Ash Waters go berserk? Evelyn Hall's expression mirrored his confusion. After you left, young master was resting. Suddenly, he said he was hungry, so I went to order food. Before the servant could even set the tray down, young master lunged at him. You saw what happened next. Damian Stone frowned. Nothing else happened. Evelyn Hall shook her head. Nothing at all. But young master, he had a vacant look in his eyes, like he was in a frenzy. Evelyn Hall's face darkened, but she added, could young master's outburst be related to your blood, sect leader? Blood? John raised his hand, the pinprick on his finger still present. If the wound on his shoulder wasn't more painful, he might have overlooked the pinprick. He frowned, bending slightly to look at the unconscious David, anguish flickering in his eyes. He pulled back his right sleeve, revealing a deep wound an inch above his wrist. It's all because of this damn thing. John abruptly stood up and waved his hand dismissively. Have the doctor treat Michael. If there are no complications, there's no need to tell me. The three remaining people exchanged glances, each sighing but remaining silent. Sarah, in particular, wished she could slap herself. The doctor arrived promptly, attending to the waiter. Downstairs first before treating David upstairs. The results, however, were unremarkable. Hearing this, John simply shook his head, no longer looking at David. David remained unconscious until the following afternoon. Upon waking, the taste of blood in his mouth startled him. Nausea rolled through his stomach, and he retched, clutching the bedpost. But because he hadn't eaten anything other than the waiter's flesh the previous day, despite his efforts, he couldn't bring anything up. His face paled. Memories flooded back, the waiter's terrified face, the taste of John's blood still on his tongue. This intensified his nausea, but unable to vomit, he shoved his fingers down his throat. This only made him gag more violently, a sour taste rising in his mouth, but still nothing came up. Sarah entered, carrying a bowl of porridge. Seeing David's state, she dropped the bowl and rushed to his side. Young master. Young master, what's wrong? Only then did Sarah clearly see David's incessant retching, tears streaming down his face. It was unclear whether he was truly crying or if it was simply a physical reaction. Helped up by Sarah, David leaned against the bed, the churning in his stomach unrelenting. Young master, you haven't eaten anything in a day. Have some porridge. Sarah placed the bowl on the bedside table and dipped a cloth in water to wipe David's face. Although his face was clean, the tears continued to flow. He looked at Sarah, his lips parting slightly, but he remained silent. Are you asking about the master? He's fine. We found a lead on the ox horn case. He's gone to investigate personally. I'm staying here to take care of you. Before David could speak, Sarah seemed to understand his unspoken question, offering a gentle explanation. David nodded and slowly finished the porridge. After Sarah left, David sat alone in the room, lost in thought. He turned and retrieved a box from the bedside table. Inside lay a piece of purple cloth, its luxurious material immediately apparent. On the cloth was a silver-tipped bamboo tube containing John's blood. David took the box and stood, his legs nearly giving way. He grabbed the bedpost, steadying himself before slowly walking to the table. He placed the box on the table and began assembling the fan ribs, carefully cutting and integrating the purple cloth into the fan. The ox horn case wasn't particularly complex. Within the Crimson Orchid Society, Peter's behavior had been far too conspicuous. Robert had already uncovered a considerable amount of information from him. Realizing his exposure, the arrogant Henry's son directly attacked the Mayflower gang. Many men within the Mayflower gang harbored resentment towards Margaret Hahn. They chafed under a woman's leadership, regardless of her past heroics against bandits. Most of these men believed a woman's place was at home, tending to husband and children, and Margaret's public role and continued claim to leadership fueled their long-standing discontent. Leading the charge was Henry's son, once admiring Margaret's strength but now resentful of his subordinate position, his frustration finally erupting. The oxhorn ginseng was indeed stolen. It was a ploy to undermine Margaret's authority within the gang, paving the way for her removal and his own ascension to leadership, a position for which he was well regarded. His well-laid plans were unexpectedly disrupted by the intervention of the divine weapon Manor, forcing him to flee. Outside Azure City, a horse galloped, its rider dissatisfied with its speed, whipping the animal relentlessly to urge it faster. A figure suddenly appeared on the road. Henry's son, unable to discern how, maintained his breakneck speed, heading straight for the figure. Damien Burns stood firm, watching the approaching horse, and with a powerful strike, broke the animal's neck. Damien's 3/10 strength blow snapped the horse's neck, sending it sprawling, and throwing Henry's son from its back. "Seize him!" Damien commanded, and Howard Harrison and Lance Green, having caught up, apprehended Henry Sunday captured. Henry's son stared at Damien, his earlier arrogance replaced by stark terror. Damien slowly approached, his displeasure evident, and demanded, "Where is the oxhorn ginseng?" Henry's son, knowing his situation was dire, confessed. "Lord Burns, spare me. I don't know where it is. Strangely dressed men stole it from me." Strangely dressed. Damien immediately thought of the Cloud Cross Manor, but Henry's next words dispelled that notion. "They wore no masks, dressed in Miaojiang attire, and their martial arts were unlike any I've seen." Hearing Miaojiang, Lance and Howard exchanged glances, noticing Damien's already grim expression darken further. He touched the bite wound on his shoulder beneath his clothes, then struck Henry's son a fatal blow to the head. Henry's son died without understanding why, denied even a plea for mercy. Though the oxhorn ginseng remained elusive, the matter was considered resolved. Damien had given Lance 3 days, a deadline now passed, but he kept Lance with him, needing him for another task. When they returned to the inn, Elliot Brooks was standing at the entrance, Evelyn Hull beside him. Across from them stood Diana Cloud, seemingly wanting to enter while they were on their way out. Elliot had only seen Diana once before, but her current gaze was unfriendly. Unwilling to engage, he simply shifted to let her pass. Diana didn't even offer a thank you as she walked inside. She currently held no fondness for Elliot, blaming him for Damien Burns's injury. Seeing her senior disciple wronged, she naturally sought justice. However, Evelyn's presence suggested Damien's involvement, so she chose not to make a scene. Damien reached the doorway, catching the eyes of both Elliot and Diana. Diana, displeased by his outing and Evelyn's protective stance towards Elliot, merely glanced at him before turning to head upstairs. Elliot stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Damien. Evelyn, Lance Green, and Howard Harrison exchanged glances, tactfully retreating. "I'm sorry." Elliot, a man of few words, coupled with his recent bout of nausea, spoke with a strained voice that made Damien frown. "It's all right. Get some rest," Damien replied with a nod, accepting Elliot's apology, then stepped past him. A pang of pain struck Elliot's heart, his eyes reddening. Yet, he didn't call out to Damien, only watching as he walked up the hallway, disappearing around the bend. Elliot lingered by the door until a passing guest jostled him, snapping him back to reality. He then turned and ascended the stairs. Shortly after Lance entered his room, a knock echoed. Opening the door, he was surprised to find Elliot standing there. "Young master. What brings you here? Come in." Lance ushered Elliot inside, his curiosity piqued. "Could I borrow some money?" Elliot went straight to the point, marking the first time he'd spoken to someone other than Damien. "Master, the young master is gone." Late into the night, Damien, roused from his weary slumber, heard these unsettling words. "What do you mean?" Damien raised his eyes to the guard standing before him. The guard, visibly nervous, recounted the recent events. "Half an hour ago, the young master went to the back courtyard for a moment. We thought he was just using the privy. But he didn't return. When we went to look, he was gone." The guard's voice trailed off as Damien's gaze sharpened. He slowly rose, walked to the table, and slammed his palm down, shattering it. "Find him." Fearful of Damien's wrath, the guard scrambled out of the room, summoning the others to join the search for the missing Elliot. The commotion roused the others. Lance and Howard, though startled, were less affected than the 2 women who emerged looking distressed. Upon learning of Elliot's disappearance, they quickly joined the search. Despite her dislike for Elliot, Diana proved compassionate, searching diligently. The 3 hall leaders, Diana, and over a dozen guards dispersed into the night, their movements quiet yet thorough, leaving no possible hiding place unchecked. Usually, John seemed quiet and didn't go out much, so he wouldn't be familiar with Brookhaven. He'd have nowhere to go, and they even entertained a grim thought, that he might have been abducted. They returned to the inn near dawn, their search fruitless. Everyone stood in David's room, silent. Knock, knock, knock. A knock came at David's door, but it was unlocked, so the attendant entered directly. This attendant was a replacement for the previous one, who was off duty due to an injury. Observing the tense atmosphere and the crowded room, the attendant was understandably nervous. He presented a box he carried, with a note on top. "Gentlemen, I found this while cleaning." The room was empty. "This box appears valuable, and it wouldn't be right for it to go missing. The guest in that room arrived with you, so I thought to bring it here." David glanced at the box, and Henry stepped forward to take it, tossing the attendant a small silver coin and dismissing him with a wave. Henry turned and placed the box on the table, stepping back a few paces. "Isn't this the fan frame I brought for John? Why didn't he keep it?" David picked up the box and opened the note. It contained a simple apology and stated that the item inside was a gift for him, a token of atonement. Setting the note aside, David opened the box. Inside was a finished fan. Beside it was another note, which he unfolded. It detailed the method for using the silver needles concealed within the fan. David picked up the fan and slowly unfolded it. The movement was fluid and graceful. The fan's face was made of the same fabric as David's clothes, smooth to the touch. The frame, crafted by Henry himself, was impeccable. David unfurled the fan and touched the fabric, his brow furrowing slightly. His expression was a mix of emotions, a touch of happiness, a hint of worry. "It seems he left on his own. Continue the search, but discreetly. Inform me when you find him." After a moment, David addressed the guards, who acknowledged his command and withdrew. Hearing David's words and seeing the notes and the fan, everyone understood that John had left of his own accord. Relief washed over them, mixed with anger at his silent departure. "I wonder how John is doing now. He left without any money, I fear he'll have a hard time." Evelyn expressed her concern. "That boy seems so naive, with a face that invites trouble. What if he's taken advantage of out there?" Lance scratched his head. "Don't worry about that. John borrowed 500 taels of silver from me. If he's careful, it should last him a while." Lance's words drew sharp gazes from David and surprised looks from the others. "After we returned yesterday, John came to me and asked to borrow money. He said he wanted to buy something to apologize to the estate master. I gave him 500 taels, no need to repay. He gave me this, saying he'd sell it to me, but I'd have to make the cord myself." Lance Green, startled, stumbled back a few steps, pulling a small hand crossbow from his chest for everyone to see, though it was unstrung. Howard Harrison's eyes lit up with interest, clearly eager to examine it, but Lance Green quickly hid the crossbow in his sleeve, not having had a chance to study it himself. "Seems like your monthly allowance is quite generous. Enough to lend money to others." Damian Burns slammed his hand on the table, his eyes fixed on Lance Green with an ambiguous smile. "Lance Green. I wouldn't dare, sir. I truly didn't know the young master borrowed money to run away." Lance Green bowed his head, avoiding Damian Burns's gaze. "Your allowance is cut for the next 6 months. Damian Burns said grimly, rubbing his temples, then waved everyone away. "You've all been up all night. Go and rest. We leave tomorrow, and the 5th of next month isn't far off." "Yes, sir." Everyone acknowledged the order and prepared to leave, but Damian Burns called Lance Green back, pointing at the table. "Leave it." Lance Green, stunned and speechless, reluctantly placed the crossbow on the table. Damian Burns looked at the fan and paper on the table, his expression unreadable. "Why did he leave?" Probably felt the master disliked him. The young master got upset. Evelyn Hall, already at the door, popped her head back in to add. Damien Burns. Meanwhile, Elliot Brooks, having ridden far away on Lance Green's horse, unbeknownst to Lance Green, was long gone, while everyone else was frantically searching for him. The reason they couldn't find him was precisely because he'd ridden away. Elliot Brooks, unfamiliar with the terrain, simply rode onward. Though he didn't find the entrance to Beechwood City, he did stumble upon its exit. However, when he found it, it was still before dawn, and the gates were closed. He had no choice but to wait, intending to be the first one out when they opened. He'd ridden without knowing where he was going. Unused to riding, his legs ached terribly after such a long time in the saddle. They felt like they no longer belonged to him. Past midday, having not eaten for 2 days, Elliot Brooks was faint with hunger. Spotting a tea stall in the distance, he urged his horse towards it. Dismounting, his legs were so weak he nearly collapsed, managing to stay upright only by leaning on the horse. He tethered the animal to a large tree by the roadside and found a seat inside the tea stall. Dizzy and lightheaded, he barely registered the other occupants, a table of menacing-looking thugs and a man and woman armed with swords. "Sir, what can I get for you?" The stall owner hurried over, wiping the table with a cloth from his shoulder and pouring Elliot Brooks a cup of tea. Too weary to speak, Elliot Brooks simply pointed at the tempting noodle buns and pickles on the stall's counter, indicating the quantity he desired. Though surprised by Elliot Brooks's silence, the stall owner didn't comment, turning to fetch the food. John Smith picked up some noodles with his chopsticks. Though tasteless on their own, they were quite palatable with pickled vegetables. He then took a bun and bit into it twice. As John continued eating, his movements slowed. He wondered if Alex White and the others had eaten yet. He'd slipped away quietly. He wondered if Alex was worried. Probably not. John bit into the bun in his mouth and slurped some noodle broth, suddenly finding it bitter. No one liked someone who might hurt them. John thought about the wound on David Brown's shoulder. He wondered how it was doing. It must be very painful. Alex White must hate him now. Why else would he have avoided him last night, ignoring him just like everyone else always had? No one liked him, not even the doctors at the psychiatric hospital. This was for the best. He was just one person, and even though Alex had been kind to him lately, now that he was gone, he wouldn't hurt him anymore. He wouldn't hurt anyone. As John berated himself, the burly man at the next table suddenly stuck out his foot and kicked the leg of John's chair, breaking it. John tumbled to the ground. John looked around, bewildered. What had just happened? The burly man chuckled and reached down, pulling John's small frame up from the floor. Come on, join us." Before John could react, the men at the burly man's table quickly grabbed his food. The burly man placed his hands on John's shoulders and pushed him back onto the chair. "Come on, eat." The burly man spoke, and his companions resumed their boisterous chatter. Still disoriented, John noticed no one was paying attention to him, so he quietly continued eating his bun and noodles. "Boss, 10 more baskets of buns, 5 more bowls of noodles." The burly man's order drew the attention of everyone else in the eatery. John glanced at the food on the table. They had already ordered a substantial amount of buns, and the bowls of noodles were stacked high. Why order more? The men ate their fill quickly, leaving nothing behind. When they were finally satiated, they had ordered several more baskets of buns. All right, let's get going, let's go," the burly man announced, rising to leave. His companions also stood, preparing to depart. "Hey, gentlemen, you haven't paid yet." The owner, who had been watching from the kitchen, spoke up. This group didn't look like decent folk. Were they planning to dine and dash? As expected, the burly man's face darkened. He slammed his large hand on the table, the force of it nearly tipping over John's bowl of noodles. Payment Payment, he bellowed angrily. What payment? Get your payment from him. The burly man pointed directly at John, who was still quietly eating his noodles. John stared back, dumbfounded. Had he just stumbled into a bizarre robbery? Others robbed money, these men robbed meals. The owner looked at John. Though just a street vendor, he wasn't a bad man. He'd noticed earlier that the young man was likely mute and was being bullied. He couldn't bring himself to be heartless. The group of burly men had consumed a considerable amount of John's food, yet judging by their current demeanor, reclaiming payment seemed like a daunting task. Forget it, the innkeeper muttered, his face crumpling. Just consider it charity for beggars. Seeing the innkeeper's silence, the leader of the group took it as acquiescence and turned to lead his men away. He noticed William's horse tethered by the roadside, grazing peacefully. David's horse wasn't necessarily a prized steed, but having been raised at the Iron Mountain Ranch, it was undeniably strong and imposing. Even if it wasn't a thoroughbred, it certainly appeared superior to an average horse. The leader's eyes lit up at the sight of William's horse. He recognized it as William's, but didn't believe William posed any threat. With casual arrogance, he approached the horse, untied the reins, and prepared to lead it away. William, witnessing this, immediately dropped his chopsticks and moved to intercept the departing man, reaching out to snatch back the reins. The burly man responded with a swift kick to William's stomach, sending him stumbling backward and collapsing onto the ground, his face pale. You mute wretch, the man sneered, I'm doing you a favor by taking a liking to your horse. If you don't cooperate, I'll take your life instead. The man's aggressive stance and tight grip on the reins revealed his clear infatuation with the horse. As the confrontation escalated, a young woman at another table, seated with a male companion, slammed her hand on the table and rose, drawing her sword. The man beside her reached out and restrained her, seemingly offering a cautionary warning. The woman's expression darkened, but she reluctantly sat back down. The commotion caused by the woman's outburst had attracted the attention of the burly men. The leader, noticing her attractiveness, handed the reins to one of his companions and approached her with a leering grin. Well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Is the little lady feeling chivalrous? Entertain me, and maybe I'll return the horse to that mute fool. The woman, clearly disgusted by his demeanor, widened her eyes and turned to her companion. William, his stomach aching, managed to pull himself to his feet. Seeing the reins in another man's hands, he refrained from another attempt to retrieve them and instead stood silently, observing the scene. The young woman's companion, who had been trying to calm her, suddenly took action. With a powerful thrust of his leg, he kicked the table in front of him towards the burly man. The burly man, possessing some rudimentary fighting skills, retreated a few steps and then, with a surprising display of strength, punched straight through the table. William glanced at the innkeeper, whose face was etched with distress as he stared at the broken table, yet dared not speak. Envious of the man sitting with the young woman and harboring lustful intentions towards her, the burly man wanted to show off his prowess before taking her by force. He attacked with unrestrained ferocity. The two men clashed in a fierce exchange of blows. However, the burly man's limited fighting skills, barely above a street brawler's, were no match for his opponent. Within a few moves, he was lying defeated on the ground. The thug, scooping up a mouthful of mud, his face grim, turned to look at his companion and complained, "What are you looking at? Get up and help me." The advantage of having more people on your side seemed to be that you could endure a bit longer. Seeing they were outnumbered, the young woman grabbed a long sword and joined the fray, her strikes even heavier than the men's. Immediately, the thugs cried out in pain. After beating all the men to the ground, the young woman clapped her hands triumphantly, her previous anger seemingly dissipated. The man just shook his head in resignation and turned to look at the thugs. "If you dare to rob anyone again, your hands will be chopped off." The thugs, kneeling on the ground and kowtowing repeatedly, understood they were being spared. With grateful expressions, they scrambled to their feet and fled. Elliot Brooks, leading his horse, was about to tie it to a tree when the young woman called out to him. "Hey, hey, hey! What are you doing? We saved you, and you don't even offer a word of thanks." Elliot Brooks turned to look at her, but first secured his horse. Then he turned back, brushed the dust off his clothes, and nodded to the two of them. The young woman started to say something but was pulled back by the man. She looked at him and saw him shake his head, then point a finger at his own throat. Only then did the young woman realize that the thugs had called him mute. Her expression immediately turned embarrassed. Elliot Brooks walked over to the tea stall owner, took out his purse, and handed the owner a silver coin. He then gestured towards the wreckage of the tea stall, which was in complete disarray, not even a single table leg remaining intact. "Thank you, kind sir, thank you, kind sir." The owner gratefully accepted the silver, realizing he'd actually made a profit, enough to buy new tables and chairs. Elliot Brooks touched his stomach. He'd only eaten half his meal earlier and was still quite hungry. Noticing this, the owner led Elliot Brooks to the stove and gave him meat buns and noodles. The noodles were topped with meat and greens, and Elliot Brooks sat down to eat. The two young rescuers exchanged glances. The young woman, ever curious and proactive, walked over to the stove. She watched Elliot Brooks, who, despite having just been beaten, was eating with gusto, clearly a forgiving soul. "What's your name?" "I'm Bianca Snow, and this is my brother, Samuel Fletcher." She pulled up a relatively intact stool by the stove and gestured towards the man with the resigned expression. Elliot Brooks, his mouth full of meat bun, picked up a chopstick and wrote his name on the stovetop. However, due to the lack of water or anything to write with, Bianca Snow couldn't decipher the markings. "Well, if you can't talk, I'll just call you Little Mute, okay?" Bianca Snow's smile was beautiful, her innocent demeanor suggesting she saw nothing wrong with the nickname. Little Mute is a nickname for someone who cannot speak. "Bianca, stop it." Samuel Fletcher stepped forward and poked his sister on the head. Bianca Snow stuck her tongue out at Samuel Fletcher but said nothing. Samuel Fletcher looked at Elliot Brooks and apologized. "Bianca speaks without thinking. Please forgive her, sir." Elliot Brooks shook his head. He didn't disagree with Bianca Snow, he simply didn't want to talk. What she called him was irrelevant. "Where are you going? Why not travel with us? In your condition, you're likely to encounter bandits. You wouldn't even be able to run." Bianca Snow asked, looking enthusiastic, seemingly very interested in Elliot Brooks. This time, Samuel Fletcher didn't try to control her, seeming to agree with her suggestion. Elliot Brooks ate, casually pointing in a direction. Anywhere but back was fine with him. Coincidentally, he gestured in the same direction the Snow siblings were headed. So the three set off together. Setting off mostly applied to the Snows, Elliot Brooks took his time, admiring the scenery. From Bianca Snow's conversation with her brother, it became clear they were hurrying home for a White Gold Star convention on the 5th of June. It took Elliot Brooks a moment to realize they were talking about black iron, or wolfram steel, a metal, yes, but one so rare as to be incredibly expensive. Because Elliot Brooks remained silent, they took him for mute. His low-key presence allowed them to speak more freely. Their original plan had been to visit the Divine Forge Manor to acquire a weapon crafted by Howard Harrison as a birthday gift. But they'd received news requiring their return for the White Gold Star convention. They were from the Whispering Cloud sect, grandchildren of the sect leader, Stephen Fletcher. The birthday gift was intended for him. The White Gold Star convention was organized by Matthew Mason, the current martial arts leader of Azure Sky Fortress. Though no longer the fortress lord, everyone knew Matthew Mason still held sway. The convention's guest list was extensive. Invitations had been sent to the 2 manors and 4 sects, and rumor had it, even the Crimson Fire cult had received one. The Crimson Fire cult was the largest heretical sect, universally reviled. If they were invited, the White Gold Star convention promised bloodshed. Elliot Brooks had already left for the next town. Damian Burns, having just departed, had traveled for half a day and finally spotted the small tea stall. The tea stall was getting new furniture. Without Elliot Brooks and his commandeered carriage, Damian Burns rode the horse that had previously pulled it. The Divine Forge Manor's guards were concealed, leaving only Damian Burns, Diana Cloud, Lance Green, Evelyn Hall, and Howard Harrison visible outside. As they sat, food was quickly brought out. Lance Green, noticing the new furniture, couldn't help but comment. "Hey, owner, looking to upgrade to a tavern? Quite the makeover." Unfazed by Lance Green's teasing, the owner grinned good-naturedly. "Someone caused a ruckus and smashed my furniture. Luckily, a kind young man gave me enough silver to buy new ones." As soon as he finished speaking, the innkeeper shook his head again. "But, what a pity, such a kind young gentleman, handsome too, with a good heart, why doesn't he speak?" Upon hearing this, they were all startled and looked over at John Smith, sitting alone at a table, and indeed saw him smiling enigmatically. Peter Jones addressed the innkeeper, the young man in blue clothes, with short hair, a round face, and large eyes, who looks quite young. "Is that the person you're talking about?" The innkeeper nodded repeatedly. Yes, yes, do you gentlemen know this young gentleman?" The innkeeper observed their attire and the horses they rode, his eyes lighting up. "That young gentleman's horse also bears the same mark on its rump. It seems you do know each other." "The horses of Skirich Manor don't bear the manor's mark. It's just that the stable master has a peculiar habit of painting a snowflake symbol in red dye on the rump of every horse he raises. John Smith's horse, of course, is no exception." Peter Jones, even more intrigued, continued his questioning. "Indeed, we do know him. He's our younger brother. He got angry with us yesterday and ran off alone." "Innkeeper, do you know which way he went?" Yes, the innkeeper pointed, "that young gentleman went that way with two other young men." "Two young men?" Peter Jones frowned. Had John Smith made new acquaintances so quickly? He glanced at David Brown, whose face remained expressionless. The innkeeper, assuming Peter Jones's question was directed at him, explained, "It's nothing. Just two young men. When the young gentleman came to eat, he was bullied and threatened. These two young men helped him, which is why they damaged my tables and chairs." "Thank you, innkeeper, for the information." Peter Jones handed some small silver coins to the innkeeper, who beamed and offered them boiled eggs and some vegetables. After a hasty meal, they mounted their horses, preparing to follow the direction John Smith had taken. David Brown hesitated for a moment. "Senior brother?" Sarah Miller, beside him, looked at David Brown. David Brown, silent for a long while, finally nodded. "Let's go." The group pursued John Smith, who was unaware of their pursuit. He was on his way to an apothecary to buy some pain-relieving balm. Not only his thighs but also his hands were blistered from the rains. Their current location was Cloud City. They had been traveling for many days, finally arriving 3 days before the 5th of June. John Smith had undoubtedly endured considerable hardship along the way. Emily White even teased him about being more delicate than a girl like herself, getting so injured from riding. But John Smith was reticent, and she received no reply, so she turned to bother Thomas Clark instead. By the time John Smith went out for the ointment, David Brown's group had also arrived in Cloud City. However, unlike Emily White and her brother, they were not met upon arrival by people from Azure Citadel, who had received prior notice of their coming. Mr. Burns. Following Damian Burns was Second Fortress Master, Matthew Mason, of Blue Sky Fortress, renowned for his cunning and vast knowledge of the underworld. If one sought his help, often a major issue could be minimized. Damian Burns remained mounted, looking down at Matthew Mason, who, unfazed, clasped his hands in greeting. Master Mason is currently arranging accommodations for guests from various sects within the fortress. He apologizes for not greeting Mr. Burns personally. Second Fortress Master is too kind. Receiving Divine Weapon Mountain Manor doesn't require Master Mason's personal attention. A smile played on Damian Burns's lips, yet his words lacked warmth. Divine Weapon Mountain Manor aligned neither with the righteous nor the wicked. They provided weapons to whoever offered sufficient payment, nothing more. Mr. Burns is too kind. Then, please, welcome to Blue Sky Fortress. Master Mason has prepared accommodations for all of you. Matthew Mason extended his hand, gesturing towards the fortress. Damian Burns hesitated, glancing at his surroundings before finally nodding and proceeding towards Blue Sky Fortress. As they departed, from a nearby apothecary, Elliot Brooks emerged, clutching several jars of ointment. He watched their receding figures, sighing softly. It seemed best to remain within the inn for the next few days, avoiding venturing out. However, upon returning to the inn, this thought was immediately dismissed by Bianca Snow. "Little Ace, our father has arrived at Blue Sky Fortress. My brother and I must go find him. Do you want to come with us?" Samuel Fletcher stood beside Bianca Snow, his expression suggesting disagreement with her decision. Yet, due to something Bianca Snow had said, he refrained from objecting. Elliot Brooks paused, then shook his head. He preferred the tranquility of the inn, safe from encountering Adam Gray and his companions. Seeing Elliot Brooks's refusal, Samuel Fletcher's spirits lifted. He patted Bianca Snow's head, saying, "Little sis, our friend has been with us throughout the journey. Perhaps he has other matters to attend to. Let's not impose, lest we delay his plans." Bianca Snow, unwilling, lowered her head and glared at Samuel Fletcher. "Brother, why are you like this? Little Ace is alone, unfamiliar with martial arts. Last time, he was bullied. What if it happens again after we leave?" Samuel Fletcher felt a headache coming on. Reasoning with his sister when her sense of justice flared was futile. Further argument might only provoke her rebellious streak. He could only look pleadingly at Elliot Brooks. Elliot Brooks prepared to shake his head again, but Bianca Snow, undeterred, grabbed his hand and anxiously pulled him outside. "Brother, go settle the bill. I'll take Little Ace to Blue Sky Fortress first." Samuel Fletcher. Elliot Brooks. Damian Burns remained unaware of Elliot Brooks's arrival at Blue Sky Fortress. After all, on another's territory, having his subordinates search everywhere would appear overbearing. And Elliot Brooks considered himself insignificant, unlikely to attract attention. Bianca and Samuel Snow's father, Thomas Snow, also paid no mind to Elliot Brooks, assuming him to be merely a companion his children had picked up along the way. Thus, Elliot Brooks stayed at Blue Sky Fortress. To avoid encountering Damian Burns and his group, after entering the fortress, he remained confined to his room, save for necessary trips to the privy. Even his meals were delivered by servants. Respecting the principle of treating guests with courtesy, the Blue Sky Fortress servants disregarded Elliot's unusual demeanor, simply considering him a slightly eccentric visitor. The 5th day of the following month arrived swiftly. Blue Sky Fortress, having assembled renowned martial arts practitioners, wasn't about to host a simple gathering. On this 6th month's 5th day, everyone was invited to a mountainous area belonging to Blue Sky Fortress, situated some distance from the main fortress. Elliot Brooks was naturally among this group, accompanying the Cloud Peak sect. Not being a prominent figure himself, and with the Snow siblings, Bianca and William, preoccupied, he trailed behind on foot, neither riding a horse nor traveling by carriage. Such a large procession of martial artists traveling together created quite a spectacle. The sheer number of people passing through often caused a stir, leading common folk to peek from their windows or, the bolder ones, to observe directly from the roadside. Blue Sky Fortress's wooded area lay outside Cloud City. Beyond these woods were smaller paths used by ordinary people, along with a main road extending outwards. As they entered the woods, the terrain became less navigable. Those who had arrived by horse or carriage dismounted, proceeding on foot. Without the large horses and bulky carriages, the procession became less congested. After another half-hour's walk, they ventured deeper into the woods, arriving before a cave. A crowd had gathered outside, and a middle-aged man in a blue robe awaited them, Michael Mason, the fortress lord of Blue Sky Fortress. Honored guests, Michael Mason greeted, his hands clasped together, I have been awaiting your arrival. A slight apologetic smile touched his face. This journey must have been arduous for you, esteemed colleagues. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Stephen Fletcher, a man of directness, interjected. The arduous journey had left him somewhat irritable. What is the reason, Master Mason, for summoning us here? Unfazed, Michael Mason waved his sleeve, revealing a black stone emitting a faint, shimmering golden light. While referred to as a stone, its appearance was unusual. Damien Burns sensed something amiss upon seeing the stone. Within his own sleeve, he concealed a thin sheet of metallic silver, its unique properties evident even from a casual glance. As you have likely surmised from the invitations, Michael Mason addressed the assembly, holding aloft the black stone, this great white gold is the reason for this gathering. As for its purpose, Lord Burns is perhaps better informed than I. He directed a knowing glance towards Damien Burns, who remained motionless within the crowd. Following Michael Mason's gaze, the others turned their attention to Damien Burns. Michael Mason, holding up the great white gold, smiled at Damien Burns, who remained motionless in the crowd. Everyone else followed Michael Mason's gaze and looked at Damien Burns. A faint smile played on Damien Burns' lips. His gaze swept over the assembled sect leaders and clan heads before he stepped forward to address their unspoken questions. This is great white gold, Damien Burns began. It is said that the divine weapon Mountain Manor can forge divine weapons. But with this great white gold, even ordinary weapons can cut through iron like mud. In my hands, my forging skills would undoubtedly reach new heights. Moreover, he continued, naturally formed great white gold is exceedingly rare. This single piece in Master Mason's possession is enough to forge a priceless divine weapon. As everyone listened intently to Damien Burns, Elliot Brooks, standing far back in the crowd, caught snippets of Damien's words. He strained to see towards the front, but only the dark mouth of the cave was visible. What Adam Miller wanted, they should find for him, even though Adam Miller greatly disliked him, but he had been very kind to him in the past. Everyone still firmly believed Damien Brown's explanation. After all, in terms of forging, few in the martial world could surpass Divine Weapon Fortress or Damien Brown. Damien Brown's explanation caused everyone to fall into hushed whispers amongst themselves, though the conversations weren't loud. However, a single piece of white star metal naturally wasn't a huge draw, so Michael Smith quickly threw out a bigger lure. Right behind me, this cave is a white star metal mine, the piece in my hand was simply picked up from within. Everyone erupted in commotion. One piece naturally wasn't much use, even if it was, it would only benefit Divine Weapon Fortress, but a whole vein was different, signifying endless wealth and power. Martial world figures naturally didn't care about power, but each sect had many mouths to feed, and expanding the sect also required considerable funds. The value of this mineral vein was unimaginable. However, with such a precious mineral vein, anyone would want to keep it hidden. How could they, like Azure Sky Fortress, flaunt it? Was this intentionally meant to make others envious? Damien Brown frowned, turning to look at Miles Grant, who was also participating in this gathering. Although Miles Grant wore half a mask, it was still recognizable from his lips that he was currently suspicious as well. What does Master Smith mean? The Wind Moon Pavilion Master was an alluring man in red robes. Although he had delicate features, paired with the red clothes he wore, it created a captivating allure, though it lacked the natural charm of Damien Brown. Knowing there would be questions, Michael Smith clasped his hands towards everyone. Everyone knows my father is the Martial Alliance leader. Every day, he is incredibly weary from martial world affairs, wanting the righteous path of the martial world to prosper further. Seeing my father grow older day by day, as his son, I'm unable to help him in any way, and I feel truly heartbroken. Michael Smith spoke movingly, a middle-aged man even shed tears. He tucked the white star metal piece into his robes and wiped his eyes. This time, our Azure Sky Fortress discovered this white star metal vein, and inviting everyone here has only one purpose, to contribute to the righteous martial world by equally dividing this mineral vein among the sects participating in the gathering. His words caused the martial world figures to frown, naturally disbelieving. Perhaps the desire to care for his aging father existed, but to go to this extent, if it wasn't filial piety that moved heaven and earth, it couldn't be done. Michael Smith also anticipated that everyone wouldn't believe his words, so he leaned over and extended his hand, gesturing an invitation. If you don't believe me, you can go down to the cave and see for yourselves. I'll accompany you at all times, guaranteeing no deception. Damian Brown looked again at the sects that had arrived. Because Azure Sky Fortress was under the Martial Alliance leader, each sect showed some degree of respect. Even the most mysterious cloud-piercing fortress had its fortress lord personally attend, bringing along quite a few people. It couldn't be said to be unimpressive. Even if each sect hadn't come in full force, they had brought their elites, at least half their strength. If there was any falsehood within the cave, many righteous martial world figures were afraid they would be buried here. If the evil sects then caused trouble from that point, the chaos would be unimaginable. Damian Burns turned his head and looked at the people he had brought with him. Aside from the guards, these individuals were all leaders within the hall, essential to the functioning of the divine weapon manor. Without them, the manor would be like a dragon without a head. Damian Burns stepped back slightly, aligning himself with Lance Green and Evelyn Hall. The two of you, stay here. Wait outside and be ready for anything. Both Lance Green and Evelyn Hall understood the implied meaning in Damian Burns' words. They nodded slightly and silently withdrew from the group. Miles Gale, who had been observing the situation, made the same decision as Damian Burns. In an instant, half of the people behind him also disappeared. Others might not have noticed, but Michael Mason, standing on higher ground, saw everything clearly. A glint of cunning flashed in his eyes. With a smile, he turned and led the way into the cave. As you are unfamiliar with this cave, I, as the host, shall lead the way. He proceeded forward, and immediately, members of various sects followed, entering the cave one after another. Elliot Brooks, bringing up the rear with the Shao Cloud sect, slowly entered as well. Lance Green, who had withdrawn some distance away, felt a flicker in the corner of his eye. He instinctively looked back and saw Elliot Brooks's figure disappearing into the cave. What is it? Evelyn Hall asked Lance Green. Lance Green frowned and looked over, jerking his thumb towards the mine entrance. Just now. I think I saw the young master. Evelyn Hall frowned upon hearing this. She didn't doubt Lance Green's observation, it was precisely because she knew he wouldn't be mistaken that she was concerned. As everyone entered the mine, the lively atmosphere of the mountain forest was immediately replaced by a gloomy chill, causing shivers in those unaccustomed to it. White star gold is inherently a frigid mineral. If you feel cold, you can use your internal energy to protect yourselves. Michael Mason, at the front, offered this reminder. After he passed, some people paused momentarily before continuing. Elliot Brooks, however, possessed no internal energy. So after shivering, a sudden urge to urinate struck him, causing him to frown. He was inside the mine, with so many people around. How could he relieve himself? Fortunately, they had only walked a short distance when they reached the ore carts. A steel cable was fixed above the carts, securing them and connecting directly to the sloping mine shaft below. Following the various sects, people descended into the mine in groups. By the time Elliot Brooks's turn came, the cart was full. Adding another person would likely overload it. Elliot Brooks voluntarily stepped aside, offering his place to someone waiting. The other person didn't hesitate, bowing their hands in thanks to Elliot Brooks before boarding the cart. After the last group had descended, Elliot Brooks breathed a sigh of relief, hurried to the side of the cliff face, and quickly undid his belt. Those who had descended into the mine were immediately assaulted by the winter-like chill and hastily circulated their internal energy for protection. Among them, only a few seemed unaffected. Torches lined the walls of the mine shaft, illuminating it like daylight. The mine was deep, and the space opened up in multiple directions. Standing there, one could see numerous branching tunnels. The Platinum Star ore is this way, everyone. Please, follow me. Michael Mason led the way, guiding them into a branch of the cavern. Damian Burns followed, but his brow was furrowed. This mine had so many branches, hiding hundreds of people would be easy. If Michael Mason truly harbored sinister intentions, carrying them out would be child's play. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, even those with strong internal energy began to feel the chill. It was only the second month of the year outside, a time of sweltering heat. None of them were dressed warmly, so this sudden cold was naturally difficult to bear. Bianca Snow, whose internal energy was shallow, could only huddle close to her father, relying on him to transmit his energy. To ward off the cold. As they ventured deeper, the minerals on the cavern walls visibly shifted from their original colors to black, with a faint golden shimmer under the torchlight. This is the deepest point. Please, have a look. Michael Mason gestured towards the black minerals on the wall, reaching out to touch them. The golden gleam of the ore reflected in his eyes. The martial artists dispersed, despite the biting cold, their eyes filled with awe as they examined the Platinum Star Oregon. The quiet mine suddenly buzzed with activity. Damian Burns approached the wall, touching the icy minerals. His eyes, however, held a fire that found no reflection in their gleam. If only this vein belonged to divine weapon manner. Damian Burns shook his head, frowning. He shouldn't have such greedy thoughts. He looked around, seeing the same avarice reflected in the eyes of every martial artist present. He glanced at Michael Mason, who was observing the martial artists, a strange smile playing on his lips. Two individuals then approached Damian Burns, one from each side, stopping about 3 feet away. On his left was Miles Gale, whose familiarity with pharmacology and frequent contact with medicines and poisons made him unafraid of the toxins Damian Burns emitted. On his right stood a woman clad in black, her eyes fixed on Damian Burns with admiration. She was Scarlett Stewart, the current leader of the Traversing Clouds Manor. Both she and Diana Cloud shared the Cloud moniker, but while Diana was aloof and untouchable like a distant star, Scarlett was a blazing fire, beautiful and alluring, tempting men to their doom. She had met Damian Burns in her youth, and they had journeyed together for a time. She had developed deep feelings for him, but Damian, preoccupied with his own issues and indifferent to romance, had never reciprocated. To him, she was just a fleeting encounter. Scarlett Stewart remained undeterred, believing Damian's aloofness stemmed from his physical condition. She tirelessly searched for remedies to alleviate his affliction, hoping to get closer to him and further their relationship. Damian Burns glanced at Scarlett Stewart but remained silent, his gaze returning to the cavern wall. There's something off about this Michael Mason. Miles Gale also looked at the wall, but without the same fascination. I intentionally walked closer to Michael Smith just now and caught a whiff of Devil's Snare on him. Devil's Snare. Damian Brown frowned. It was a crucial ingredient in disguise masks, enhancing realism and minimizing skin damage. Pay closer attention. Miles Gray said curtly, turning to leave. Miles Gray departed, but Scarlett Evans lingered, her gaze fixed on Damian Brown's face. Mark, I've finally found the antidote to your poison. I've waited so long. I can finally be close to you again. Damian Brown scowled, distancing himself from Scarlett Evans. Lady Evans, I fear I haven't been clear enough. I only see you as a passing acquaintance. It's best you keep your distance, lest I be tempted to use you as a pawn. The Silver Sword Manor and the Cloud Peak Manor have a long-standing feud, though it's been mediated by many in the martial world. Despite their animosity, they haven't openly retaliated. When Lewis Hamilton was the leader, the previous head of Cloud Peak Manor attempted to assassinate him. Lewis, however, was more skilled and wounded him instead, sparking the feud. Lewis's injuries weren't severe, and with mediation, the matter subsided. The reason behind the previous Cloud Peak Manor head's assassination attempt remains unknown to most, but Damian, as Lewis's disciple, knows something of it. This is why even those within Cloud Peak Manor find him disagreeable. During my travels, I was unaware of Scarlett Evans's connection to Cloud Peak Manor, hence our peaceful coexistence. However, I can never truly like her. Mark, why do you treat me this way? My feelings for you have never changed. Why do you keep pushing me away? Is it truly because of the grudges of the previous generation that you blame the innocent? Scarlett Evans was visibly hurt by Damian Brown's words, her alluring features conveying a heartbreaking vulnerability. Damian Brown, however, was disgusted. Innocent? Lady Evans, only you know what you've done. I will entertain your affections no longer. With that, Damian Brown flicked his sleeve and departed. Scarlett Evans was about to speak but was interrupted by Michael Smith's voice, leaving her dejected. As you can all clearly see, this mineral vein is pure starstone. Michael Smith clapped his hands, drawing everyone's attention. The sect leaders nodded, praising the previously proposed equal distribution of the starstone vein. Michael Smith gave a strange smile, looking down on the martial artists with disdain. If you all like this starstone vein so much, then stay here. As his words fell, over 100 figures in black emerged from the mine shafts. These figures, armed with sharp blades, immediately attacked the crowd, killing without hesitation. In an instant, the less skilled martial artists at the rear were slaughtered, caught completely off guard. The sect leaders, however, reacted quickly, engaging the black-clad figures alongside many others. Some shouted at Michael Smith in outrage. Michael Stone, you dare betray the righteous path and plot to murder members of numerous martial arts sects. Michael Stone remained silent, his hand reaching behind him to grope the cliff face, finding a protruding rock and pressing it. The cliff face behind him turned out to be a large stone door. After he pressed the rock, the cliff slowly opened, and then Elliot Carter stood on the other side of the stone door, holding a crossbow in his hand, the arrow aimed directly at the center of Michael Stone's back. After Elliot Carter left, he took a cart down into the mine, but afterward, he became disoriented. Because there were too many branches, he couldn't distinguish which path everyone had taken. The rock surface was mineral, and for some reason, it had been cleaned, so no footprints were visible. At this point, Elliot Carter felt a bit cold. He looked up at the path ahead, continuing seemed a bit troublesome, so he could only choose to search each mine shaft for people. Even if he didn't find anyone, he shouldn't get lost. The original waiting area was a bit too cold for him. But he had clearly overestimated his sense of direction. After turning a few corners, he completely forgot the way back, and the air grew colder and colder. The clothes he wore weren't as thick as those of the martial artists, who could use their internal energy to protect themselves from the cold, let alone an ordinary person like Elliot Carter. Under these circumstances, even with torches on the cliff walls, his expression gradually became numb. It was too quiet, truly quiet, so quiet that he thought he was the only one there. Even though the mine was very large, it made him incredibly afraid. He took the crossbow from his sleeve. After loading a bolt, his finger remained on the trigger, keeping the arrow pointed outwards in front of his chest, giving him a slight sense of security. After turning a few more corners, Elliot Carter's face became expressionless. The air grew colder, and his hands, now blue with cold, gripped the crossbow tightly. Suddenly, he seemed to hear the clang of metal coming from somewhere. The numb expression on Elliot Carter's face twitched, and he unconsciously ran towards the source of the sound. After several turns, Elliot Carter finally reached the source of the sound, only to be blocked by another cliff face. But the expression on Elliot Carter's face was much more animated than before. He leaned against the cliff and listened. Many sounds came from behind it, the clang of metal, cries of pain. It sounded chaotic. Just as Elliot Carter was considering which path might lead to the cave on the opposite cliff face, the cliff suddenly vibrated violently, then slowly opened a passage. Elliot Carter stumbled back in surprise, instinctively aiming his crossbow at the opening. As the opening widened, Elliot Carter smelled the thick stench of blood and cold air. The cliff opened quickly, and Elliot Carter soon saw a person standing before his crossbow, but because the person was much taller than him, he couldn't see clearly what was happening inside. He couldn't see the situation inside, but that didn't mean others couldn't see him. David Burns and Bethany Snow, standing on opposite sides of the opening, saw him clearly. David Burns hadn't yet spoken when Bethany Snow called out, "Little Ace." Just hearing this form of address made David Burns frown and squint at Bethany Snow, who huddled beside Susan Graham. The sudden cry startled everyone, silencing even those locked in combat. It was clear now to the black-clad figures, Michael Mason intended to use them as sacrifices, to buy his own escape. David Brennan observed the black-clad figures. Their fury was palpable, not the resignation of Michael Mason's loyal soldiers, but rather the outrage of those manipulated. Michael Mason was aware of the additional presence behind him. He couldn't fathom it. Every martial arts sect should have been accounted for. How could there be another, emerging from behind the stone gate? Moreover, judging by the heavy, cold-induced breathing, this newcomer was clearly an ordinary person, unskilled in martial arts. "Young master, this man has employed treacherous schemes to harm the righteous martial world. We implore you to hand him over to us." Stephen Foster was now furious. Though he hadn't personally engaged, his disciples had, and several had fallen to the blades of the black-clad figures. Bianca Snow's earlier call to Ethan Bell had reached him, but the angle had obscured his view of Susan Miller. Now, with Stephen Foster speaking, Ethan Bell naturally turned to look inside. David Brennan, having witnessed the scene unfold, instinctively spoke up. "Ash Waters, don't move." Ethan Bell, acutely sensitive to David Brennan's presence, instinctively froze at his words, remaining perfectly still. David Brennan glanced at the site of the recent carnage, bodies strewn on the ground, blood still flowing. He frowned at the other sections. "Would you kindly attend to these men? My friend cannot bear to witness such sights." The other sects, surprised by David Brennan's acquaintance with the unseen figure behind Michael Mason, exchanged glances before moving the bodies to a less visible corner. The bloodstains on the ground, however, remained. Strangely, the black-clad figures didn't intervene. Despite the scene, Michael Mason remained oddly calm. He could feel the weapon lodged in his back, yet fear eluded him. He had embarked on this course with a certain assurance, a hidden advantage. A slight distance separated everyone from Michael Mason. Ethan Bell, lacking any martial arts skill, was deemed insignificant by Michael Mason. David Brennan's gaze, fixed on the scene, caught Michael Mason's subtle shift. As Michael Mason spun, launching a palm strike towards Ethan Bell, David Brennan sprang into action, a venomous palm aimed at Michael Mason's back. Ethan Bell, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, instinctively squeezed the crossbow's trigger. The released bolt met Michael Mason's incoming hand. The sheer force drove the bolt clean through his palm and deep into his shoulder. The impact of the bolt disrupted Michael Mason's palm strike, allowing David Brennan's attack to land squarely in the center of his back. The force of the blow sent a torrent of blood and gore spraying from Michael Mason's mouth, splattering Ethan Bell's face and clothing. David Brennan's eyes widened. He sidestepped Michael Mason, pulling Ethan Bell into his arms, shielding his eyes. He could feel the tremors running through Ethan Bell, the clear distress caused by the gruesome spray. A warm, slightly ticklish sensation emanated from the palm of his hand. Damien Burns looked down at the person in his arms. Was he crying? Why was he crying? Michael Mason, struck by Damien Burns's blow, was barely breathing. He lay on the ground, watching the two embrace, then turned his head to look at the assembled martial arts sects, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Do you think you can escape now that I'm dead? Don't be fools. You'll likely die even more miserably than I, ha ha ha. The cruel laughter gradually faded. Michael Mason, killed by Damien Burns's palm strike, left the martial arts world in stunned silence. The quiet didn't last long. As if to confirm Michael Mason's words, a violent rumble came from beneath the ground, followed by two loud explosions, like heavy objects falling to earth. Immediately, sects dispatched people towards the two sources of the explosions, one in the direction they had come from, the other towards where Elliot Brooks had been. The scouts quickly returned with their findings. Both paths were blocked. The path they had taken was obstructed by large boulders, while Elliot Brooks's path was sealed by a stone wall. It was called a stone wall because the scouts discovered numerous gaps in it. Looking closely, they could see blue glowing arrow tips within, clearly coated with a potent poison. Hearing this, the hot-headed Stephen Fletcher stepped forward and stomped on the dead Michael Mason's neck, breaking it. The stomp wasn't forceful. Under the flickering firelight, a line appeared beneath Michael Mason's neck. Stephen Fletcher bent down, touched it, and then pulled, peeling off a human skin mask. This is Grinless Jones, one of the 5 deadly assassins of the Emberfire cult. Stephen Fletcher's words rippled through the crowd. They had heard rumors of the Emberfire cult's involvement before arriving, but they hadn't expected to encounter one of its members in this way. Damien Burns paid no attention to this. Elliot Brooks, held tightly in his arms, was gripping his hand over his eyes, teeth gritted in silent anguish. Damien Burns could only wipe Elliot Brooks's face clean, whispering comforting words in his ear. Ash, it's all right, it's all right. I'm here with you, it's okay. While the sect leaders remained composed, the disciples below were terrified. If both escape routes were truly blocked, they were trapped. Lord Burns, do you have a solution? Jiyan Daoist, leader of the Chongshu sect, stepped forward. His junior brother had come to Mount Fei Tua to attend Thomas Fletcher's wedding. At this point, aside from a few minor sects, only the 2 estates and 4 sects remained, with the Rivermist estate and the Divine Weapon estate at the forefront. The Rivermist estate's actions had undoubtedly made many enemies. Moreover, Scarlett Stewart was a woman, and her martial arts skills were inferior to Damien Burns's. While no one openly dismissed Scarlett Stewart for being a woman, given the current male-dominated situation, they naturally preferred to hear Damien Burns's opinion. All eyes were on Damien Burns, who was still comforting Elliot Brooks in his arms. Everyone frowned. Howard Harrison and Diana Cloud were surprised by Elliot Brooks's presence but didn't dwell on it. Others, however, were not so easily appeased. For Damien Burns, known for his deadly touch, to hold someone in his arms like this, it meant either he intended to kill Elliot Brooks or Elliot Brooks possessed some unique quality that made him immune to Damien Burns's lethal touch. Scarlett Stewart watched the two interact intimately, her face burning, yet she didn't approach. Damien Burns patted Elliot Brooks twice on the back and gestured to Diana Cloud. Diana Cloud approached and, without prompting, produced a 3-finger-wide blue ribbon from her sleeve. Damien Burns used the ribbon to blindfold Elliot Brooks, sparing him the sight of the blood-soaked ground and Grinless Jones's corpse. Ash Waters, be good. I'm holding you. There's nothing here. Elliot Brooks's lips were bloodless, his expression dazed. The ordeal had calmed him somewhat, but his empty stomach gnawed with hunger. Still, he obediently nodded. Damien Burns, carrying Elliot Brooks, stepped over Grinless Jones's body and approached the group. He nodded to everyone. You two were right earlier. We'll need the two sect leaders to investigate the large boulder and the wall. If the boulder can be moved, excellent. If not, we'll have to find the mechanism in the stone wall. If there's a mechanism in the wall, there must be a way to disable it. Everyone nodded in agreement with Damian Burns, but then exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted the task. Moving the boulder would be humiliating if they failed, and the wall could be deadly. I'll go to the boulder. Miles Gale's voice cut through the tension, cold and decisive. Brother, I'll go to the wall, Diana Cloud said, her eyes filled with disdain for the martial artists. They seemed so fragile, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. I'll go with you. Scarlett Stewart stepped forward. Scarlett Stewart stepped forward. Diana Cloud glanced at Damian Burns. Seeing no objection, she nodded in agreement. The martial artists showered the three with flattery, but they ignored the empty praise and turned to leave. Those with a shred of self-respect flushed with embarrassment, while the shameless ones stared blankly, pretending nothing had happened. After the three departed, the crowd quieted. Bianca Snow, glancing around, tugged on Samuel Fletcher's sleeve and subtly gestured toward Elliot Brooks. Samuel Fletcher frowned and shook his head. He had always considered Elliot Brooks ordinary. Now, he discovered Elliot was connected to the divine weapon manor. Damian Burns called him a friend, but it didn't seem like an ordinary friendship. Bianca Snow pouted, released Samuel Fletcher, and ran towards Damian Burns. Samuel Fletcher and Stephen Fletcher were taken aback by her impulsive action and couldn't stop her. Lord Burns, my name is Bianca Snow, she said, stopping a few inches from him. Bianca Snow stood a few inches from Damian Burns, smiling brightly. Damian Burns frowned at her, clearly not recognizing her. He glanced in the direction she had come from, then nodded. Miss Snow, is there something I can do for you? Bianca Snow blushed, not because of Damian Burns's face, but as she pointed at the silent, blindfolded Elliot Brooks in his arms. She stammered, unable to speak. Observing Bianca Snow's demeanor and looking down at the quiet, blindfolded Elliot Brooks in his arms, Damian Burns couldn't help but misinterpret the situation. Had she taken a liking to Ash Waters? With his beauty and quiet obedience, and his immunity to Damian's toxins, Ash Waters was beyond the reach of ordinary people. This young woman doesn't seem like a suitable match. Although her appearance is pretty, not to mention Lydia Cloud, Evelyn Hall is also much prettier than her. From her posture to her martial arts skills, she's ordinary, so how can she protect Ash Waters? Brother, you're so strange, straight face. Actually, Bianca Snow is also very beautiful, otherwise, that strong man who fought wouldn't have taken a fancy to her. In the eyes of ordinary people, she's extremely beautiful, it's just that Damian Burns is used to seeing beautiful women, so his standards are naturally higher. Speaking of martial arts, Damian Burns's martial arts skills are powerful, and his internal energy is profound. Even Bianca Snow's grandfather, Stephen Fletcher, is no match for him, let alone Bianca Snow, who is just an ordinary person in his eyes. Miss Snow, are you looking for Ash Waters? I'm afraid it's not convenient right now. Ash Waters can't look at these filthy things. After saying that, Damian Burns gestured for Bianca Snow to look at the bloodstains on the ground. Bianca Snow glanced at the bloodstains and wholeheartedly agreed with Damian Burns's words. Even someone who travels the martial arts world like her doesn't like it, let alone an ordinary person like Ash. If it weren't for her father's protection just now, she might have lost her life here. Nodding in understanding, Bianca Snow didn't think much of it. She said a word of interruption and then returned to her father's side, only to be earnestly lectured by Samuel Fletcher and Tessa Graham for a long time. Elliot Brooks leaned quietly against Damian Burns's chest. The feeling of being splashed with blood earlier had faded. Although his stomach was still empty, he no longer felt the urge to bite someone. The smell of blood, which had initially assaulted his nostrils, lessened considerably because he was in Damien Burns's embrace. Even the cold air didn't seem as uncomfortable. The scent on Damien Burns was actually very faint. Even when leaning in so close, the smell wasn't strong but lingered around his nostrils, just right. This scent would usually bewitch others, but Elliot Brooks felt strangely at peace. Even though this person had previously been disgusted by him biting him, Elliot Brooks still felt very safe now. It was good not to be bewitched by blood and flesh, and not to feel lonely. Elliot Brooks reached out and hugged Damien Burns, burying his head in his chest, the corners of his mouth curving upwards. However, this scene had a different meaning in the eyes of others. A man and a woman embracing like this meant a handsome man and a beautiful woman. What did it mean for two men to embrace so intimately? Some martial artists who had interacted with them laughed disdainfully. The people beside them couldn't help but ask, and immediately, many people there huddled together, whispering and pointing at the two of them. Damien Burns didn't care what they thought. He stiffened slightly from the sensation on his back. Looking down at Elliot Brooks in his arms, that smile caused a stir in his heart, a ticklish feeling spreading throughout his body. Why was this happening? What was this feeling? Damien Burns knew clearly that this wasn't the first time he'd felt this way with Elliot Brooks, but that time it was because Elliot Brooks was sucking on his finger. While Damien Burns was still pondering why, the three people who had gone out returned. However, when Miles Gale came back, the clothes on his body weren't clean. I used all my strength, but I couldn't budge that large stone button at all. Miles Gale brushed the dust off his clothes and shook his head at everyone. Scarlett Stewart didn't say anything. It was unknown what had happened, but her face was slightly pale. Since she wouldn't speak, Lydia Cloud had to. There's indeed a mechanism designed on the wall. We just need to push the wall with strong force, and the mechanism will be activated. We didn't find any switches to activate the mechanism inside, so it should be on the other side of the wall. Discovering both sides were disappointing, Damien Burns finally spoke. Let's go to the wall together. The large stone can't be moved, but the mechanism still offers some hope. His words offered a sliver of hope, so everyone stood and headed towards the wall, away from the blood-soaked area.